Every hospital slammed its doors shut as billionaire Olalekan Adeyemi fought for every breath inside the back of a speeding ambulance. Doctors shook their heads. Administrators whispered excuses. Even the nation's finest specialists walked away, while time slipped through his fingers. Then, on a dusty roadside, a barefoot village girl stepped forward, carrying nothing but a single sterile needle and the quiet confidence of someone no one believed. Before anyone could stop her, she saw the one life-saving clue that every expert had missed. But who was this unknown girl? And why did Africa's most powerful man have only her left to trust? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. If you enjoy heartfelt stories of hope, justice, and unexpected miracles, please subscribe and join our growing community. The morning sun rose gently over Ogun State, casting a warm golden light across the winding highway that cut through green farmlands and quiet villages. Farmers were already tending their crops. Children in neatly pressed uniforms walked toward school, and roadside vendors arranged baskets of oranges, yams, and roasted corn for the day's first customers. Few people noticed the convoy of black SUVs moving steadily along the road. Inside the lead vehicle sat Olalekan Adeyemi, one of Nigeria's most admired entrepreneurs. At 58 years old, he had built one of West Africa's largest manufacturing and logistics companies from almost nothing. Newspapers often called him the billionaire who never forgot where he came from. Yet those who worked closely with him knew something the public rarely saw. Olalekan hated being praised. Whenever reporters tried to describe him as a hero, he would simply smile and reply, "The day people no longer need my help is the day I will deserve praise." That sentence had become famous across the country. Unlike many wealthy executives who spent their weekends on private islands or luxury yachts, Olalekan preferred visiting the communities where his foundation built schools, clinics, and clean water projects. That morning was supposed to be another ordinary inspection. His destination was a small rural clinic that had recently received medical equipment donated by the Adeyemi Foundation. Beside him sat his wife, Yetunde Akinola, an elegant woman whose calm presence had balanced her husband's demanding life for more than 30 years. She glanced away from her tablet and smiled. "You've canceled 3 meetings in Lagos just to visit one little clinic." Olalekan looked out the window. "Sometimes one forgotten village teaches you more than 10 board meetings." Yetunde laughed softly. "You've been saying that for years." "And I still mean it." Behind them, another SUV carried Dr. Chibuzo Okoye, Olalekan's longtime personal physician. Dr. Chibuzo had traveled with him for nearly 15 years. He understood one important fact better than anyone. Although Olalekan appeared energetic, he had quietly ignored warning signs from his own body for months. Long working hours, little sleep, constant travel, skipped medical checkups. Whenever Dr. Chibuzo suggested slowing down, Olalekan would answer with the same gentle smile. "There are still too many people waiting." The doctor had learned that arguing rarely changed his mind. Instead, he simply watched him more carefully. Several kilometers ahead, Security Chief Yetunde Akinola spoke through the convoy's radio. "Road conditions are clear. Arrival in 22 minutes. Everything appeared peaceful. Children waved at the passing vehicles. Olalekan rolled down the window and waved back. He never liked heavily tinted windows separating him from ordinary people. One little boy chased the convoy for several seconds, laughing happily before stopping near a mango tree. Olalekan smiled. "I used to do exactly that." Yetunde looked at him. "Running after expensive cars?" "No." He chuckled, wondering what life looked like inside them. Silence filled the vehicle for a moment. Then his expression became thoughtful. "My father never saw a luxury car in his life." She gently squeezed his hand. But he would be proud of you. Olalekan slowly shook his head. I hope he'd be proud that I remembered being poor. The convoy continued deeper into the countryside. The roads became narrower. Fields stretched endlessly across the landscape. Women balanced baskets on their heads. Motorcycles carefully passed ox carts. Everything moved with the peaceful rhythm of rural life. Suddenly, Olalekan stopped speaking. His breathing changed. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. A slow inhale, then another. Aderonke turned toward him. Are you all right? He nodded once. I think... He paused. I'm just tired. His voice sounded strangely weak. Within seconds, sweat appeared across his forehead, despite the cool air inside the vehicle. Dr. Chibuzo, riding behind them, received an urgent message through the convoy radio. Doctor to lead vehicle, pull over immediately. The convoy stopped beside the road. Dr. Chibuzo rushed into the SUV. The moment he saw Olalekan's face, his own expression changed completely. His patient's skin had become unusually pale. His breathing was becoming shallow. His fingers trembled uncontrollably. What happened? Olalekan struggled to answer. My chest. He pressed one hand against the center of his chest before suddenly freezing. Then his eyes rolled slightly upward. Aderonke gasped, Olalekan! His body leaned sideways. Dr. Chibuzo immediately checked his pulse. It was racing, far too fast. Then, without warning, it slowed dramatically. The doctor's calm voice became urgent. We need oxygen now. The emergency medical kit was opened immediately. Portable monitors were connected. A blood pressure cuff tightened around Olalekan's arm. The reading appeared. Dr. Chibuzo frowned. That's impossible. His blood pressure had dropped to a dangerously low level. Another reading, even lower. The doctor quickly administered oxygen while examining every possible cause. Heart attack. The symptoms didn't completely match. Stroke. Something felt wrong. Severe allergic reaction. No obvious signs. Poisoning. There was no evidence. Nothing made sense. Olalekan suddenly opened his eyes for only a brief moment. He looked directly at Aderonke. If... His breathing became interrupted. Don't let... Another pause. The projects. His wife grabbed his hand tightly. Don't talk. You'll be all right. But fear had already entered her voice. Dr. Chibuzo interrupted firmly. I need everyone except Mrs. Adeyemi outside. Security officers stepped back. Medical equipment beeped rapidly. The convoy suddenly felt terrifyingly quiet. Outside, Tunde Balogun immediately contacted the nearest hospital. We have a critical emergency involving Mr. Olalekan Adeyemi. The reply came almost instantly. We're preparing. Relief briefly crossed Tunde's face. He turned toward the convoy. We're moving. The vehicles accelerated. Sirens echoed across the countryside. Inside the SUV, Dr. Chibuzo continued examining every monitor. His experience told him something was terribly wrong. Olalekan's condition was changing too quickly. Every few minutes, one symptom disappeared, while another appeared. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Aderonke whispered through trembling lips, You've treated him for years. Tell me honestly, will he survive? For the first time in 15 years, Dr. Chibuzo could not answer immediately. He looked once more at the monitors, then at the unconscious man who had spent decades helping strangers. Finally, he spoke quietly. I don't know. The words shattered the silence inside the vehicle. Outside, the convoy sped toward hope. Inside, every passing minute felt like another step toward losing the man who had spent his entire life saving everyone except himself. None of them knew that before this day ended, hospitals across the region would make a decision that would shock the entire nation. Fan 1. Every hospital slammed its doors shut as billionaire Olalekan Adeyemi fought for every breath inside the back of a speeding ambulance. Doctors shook their heads. Administrators whispered excuses. Even the nation's finest specialists walked away while time slipped through his fingers. Then, on a dusty roadside, a barefoot village girl stepped forward carrying nothing but a single sterile needle and the quiet confidence of someone no one believed. Before anyone could stop her, she saw the one life-saving clue that every expert had missed. But who was this unknown girl? And why did Africa's most powerful man have only her left to trust? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. If you enjoy heartfelt stories of hope, justice, and unexpected miracles, please subscribe and join our growing community. Ket Thuk Fan 1. Tiep Tuk Yu Kao Viet Du 900 1102 Theo Quident. Fan 2. The morning sun rose gently over Ogun State, casting a warm golden light across the winding highway that cut through green farmlands and quiet villages. Farmers were already tending their crops. Children in neatly pressed uniforms walked toward school, and roadside vendors arranged baskets of oranges, yams, and roasted corn for the day's first customers. Few people noticed the convoy of black SUVs moving steadily along the road. Inside the lead vehicle sat Olalekan Adeyemi, one of Nigeria's most admired entrepreneurs. At 58 years old, he had built one of West Africa's largest manufacturing and logistics companies from almost nothing. Newspapers often called him the billionaire who never forgot where he came from. Yet those who worked closely with him knew something the public rarely saw. Olalekan hated being praised. Whenever reporters tried to describe him as a hero, he would simply smile and reply, "The day people no longer need my help is the day I will deserve praise." That sentence had become famous across the country. Unlike many wealthy executives who spent their weekends on private islands or luxury yachts, Olalekan preferred visiting the communities where his foundation built schools, clinics, and clean water projects. That morning was supposed to be another ordinary inspection. His destination was a small rural clinic that had recently received medical equipment donated by the Adeyemi Foundation. Beside him sat his wife, Yetunde Akinola, an elegant woman whose calm presence had balanced her husband's demanding life for more than 30 years. She glanced away from her tablet and smiled. "You've cancelled 3 meetings in Lagos just to visit one little clinic." Olalekan looked out the window. "Sometimes one forgotten village teaches you more than 10 board meetings." Aderonke laughed softly. "You've been saying that for years, and I still mean it." Behind them, another SUV carried Dr. Chibuzo Okoye, Olalekan's longtime personal physician. Dr. Chibuzo had traveled with him for nearly 15 years. He understood one important fact better than anyone. Although Olalekan appeared energetic, he had quietly ignored warning signs from his own body for months. Long working hours, little sleep, constant travel, skipped medical checkups. Whenever Dr. Chibuzo suggested slowing down, Olalekan would answer with the same gentle smile. "There are still too many people waiting." The doctor had learned that arguing rarely changed his mind. Instead, he simply watched him more carefully. Several kilometers ahead, Security Chief Yetunde Balogun spoke through the convoy's radio. "Road conditions are clear. Arrival in 22 minutes. Everything appeared peaceful. Children waved at the passing vehicles. Olalekan rolled down the window and waved back. He never liked heavily tinted windows separating him from ordinary people. One little boy chased the convoy for several seconds, laughing happily before stopping near a mango tree. Olalekan smiled. "I used to do exactly that." Aderonke looked at him. "Running after expensive cars?" "No." He chuckled, wondering what life looked like inside them. Silence filled the vehicle for a moment. Then his expression became thoughtful. My father never saw a luxury car in his life. She gently squeezed his hand. But he would be proud of you. Olalekan slowly shook his head. I hope he'd be proud that I remembered being poor. The convoy continued deeper into the countryside. The roads became narrower. Fields stretched endlessly across the landscape. Women balanced baskets on their heads. Motorcycles carefully passed ox carts. Everything moved with the peaceful rhythm of rural life. Suddenly, Olalekan stopped speaking. His breathing changed. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. A slow inhale, then another. Aderonke turned toward him. Are you all right? He nodded once. I think. He paused. I'm just tired. His voice sounded strangely weak. Within seconds, sweat appeared across his forehead, despite the cool air inside the vehicle. Dr. Chibuzo, riding behind them, received an urgent message through the convoy radio. Doctor to lead vehicle, pull over immediately. The convoy stopped beside the road. Dr. Chibuzo rushed into the SUV. The moment he saw Olalekan's face, his own expression changed completely. His patient's skin had become unusually pale. His breathing was becoming shallow. His fingers trembled uncontrollably. What happened? Olalekan struggled to answer. My chest. He pressed one hand against the center of his chest before suddenly freezing. Then his eyes rolled slightly upward. Aderonke gasped. Olalekan! His body leaned sideways. Dr. Chibuzo immediately checked his pulse. It was racing, far too fast. Then, without warning, it slowed dramatically. The doctor's calm voice became urgent. We need oxygen now. The emergency medical kit was opened immediately. Portable monitors were connected. A blood pressure cuff tightened around Olalekan's arm. The reading appeared. Dr. Chibuzo frowned. That's impossible. His blood pressure had dropped to a dangerously low level. Another reading, even lower. The doctor quickly administered oxygen while examining every possible cause. Heart attack. The symptoms didn't completely match. Stroke. Something felt wrong. Severe allergic reaction. No obvious signs. Poisoning. There was no evidence. Nothing made sense. Olalekan suddenly opened his eyes for only a brief moment. He looked directly at Aderonke. If. His breathing became interrupted. Don't let. Another pause. The projects. His wife grabbed his hand tightly. Don't talk. You'll be all right. But fear had already entered her voice. Dr. Chibuzo interrupted firmly. I need everyone except Mrs. Adeyemi outside. Security officers stepped back. Medical equipment beeped rapidly. The convoy suddenly felt terrifyingly quiet. Outside, Tunde Balogun immediately contacted the nearest hospital. We have a critical emergency involving Mr. Olalekan Adeyemi. The reply came almost instantly. We're preparing. Relief briefly crossed Tunde's face. He turned toward the convoy. We're moving. The vehicles accelerated. Sirens echoed across the countryside. Inside the SUV, Dr. Chibuzo continued examining every monitor. His experience told him something was terribly wrong. Olalekan's condition was changing too quickly. Every few minutes, one symptom disappeared, while another appeared. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Aderonke whispered through trembling lips, You've treated him for years. Tell me honestly, will he survive? For the first time in 15 years, Dr. Chibuzo could not answer immediately. He looked once more at the monitors, then at the unconscious man who had spent decades helping strangers. Finally, he spoke quietly. I don't know. The words shattered the silence inside the vehicle. Outside, the convoy sped toward hope. Inside, every passing minute felt like another step toward losing the man who had spent his entire life saving everyone except himself. None of them knew that before this day ended, hospitals across the region would make a decision that would shock the entire nation. Kethuk Fan 2. Tiep Tokyu Kau Viet de 900-1100 to Theo Kuidin. Fan 3. The convoy reached the first regional hospital in less than 12 minutes. Its white-painted buildings stood behind a rusted iron gate, and a team of nurses rushed outside as the sirens echoed through the compound. For a brief moment, Aderonke believed they had finally arrived somewhere that could save her husband. Olalekan remained unconscious. His breathing had become irregular. The portable cardiac monitor emitted sharp warning tones every few seconds. Dr. Chibuzo climbed out first. "We need the emergency department immediately," he shouted. "He's unstable." Several nurses hurried forward with a stretcher, while an emergency physician followed close behind. The doctor barely glanced at Olalekan before asking, "What diagnosis?" "We don't know yet," Dr. Chibuzo admitted. "Rapid cardiovascular collapse, multiple changing symptoms. Blood pressure continues dropping despite intervention." The physician frowned. "Bring him inside." Hope returned for only a few seconds. Then another senior administrator hurried into the entrance carrying a folder. He whispered something into the physician's ear. The doctor's expression changed immediately. He looked back toward Dr. Chibuzo with visible discomfort. "I'm sorry." Dr. Chibuzo stared at him. "What do you mean you're sorry? Our intensive care unit is already beyond capacity. You have empty beds. They're reserved." "For whom?" The administrator stepped forward instead. "This hospital cannot accept responsibility for such a high-profile patient." Aderonke could hardly believe what she was hearing. "My husband is dying." "We understand." "No." Her voice cracked. "You don't." She pointed toward the ambulance. "If that were your husband lying there, would paperwork matter?" The administrator lowered his eyes but remained silent. Security Chief Tunde Balogun stepped closer. "This isn't a request. We're dealing with a medical emergency." The administrator swallowed nervously. "We've received instructions." "Instructions from who?" Again, silence. Dr. Chibuzo felt anger rising inside him. As physicians, our first responsibility is the patient. The emergency doctor looked ashamed. "I know. Then do your job." "I can't." "Why not?" "My medical license. My position." He stopped speaking. Someone was clearly exerting pressure. Before anyone could argue further, Olalekan's monitor sounded another alarm. His oxygen level dropped again. Dr. Chibuzo immediately returned to the ambulance. "We're leaving." "There isn't another choice." The convoy accelerated once more. Inside the vehicle, Aderonke fought to remain calm. She gently brushed her husband's forehead with a handkerchief. His skin felt colder than before. She whispered quietly, "You promised we'd grow old together." No response. Only the rhythm of machines struggling to measure a weakening heartbeat. 25 minutes later, they arrived at a larger teaching hospital. This facility had better equipment, more specialists, a modern emergency department. Surely this place could help. Doctors immediately surrounded the stretcher. Blood samples were prepared. Portable ultrasound equipment was wheeled toward the entrance. Then, everything stopped. One phone call, one conversation, one silent nod. The department director slowly removed his gloves. "We recommend transferring him to Lagos." Dr. Chibuzo stared in disbelief. "Transfer? Yes. He won't survive another 3-hour journey. We're unable to manage this case. You haven't even examined him. Our specialists have reviewed the information." "You reviewed paperwork." You didn't review the patient." The director looked genuinely troubled. "I wish circumstances were different." "What circumstances?" Again, no answer. Aderonke stepped forward. Her normally composed voice carried unmistakable pain. "My husband has donated millions to hospitals. He never asked who people voted for. He never asked what tribe they belonged to. He never asked whether helping them was convenient. He simply helped." She looked around at every doctor standing nearby. "Today he needs your help." Nobody moved. One elderly nurse quietly wiped tears from her eyes. She wanted to speak. Instead, she lowered her head. The convoy departed once more. News traveled faster than the vehicles. Someone had taken photographs outside the first hospital. Another person recorded videos at the second. Within an hour, social media exploded. Billionaire turned away from hospital. Emergency care refused. What is happening to Olalekan Adeyemi? Television stations interrupted regular programming. Radio hosts demanded explanations. Ordinary Nigerians watched the unfolding crisis with disbelief. Many remembered schools built by the Adeyemi Foundation. Others remembered scholarships, free surgeries, water projects, food programs. Across the country, prayers began filling churches and mosques. Yet, inside the ambulance, none of that could lower Olalekan's fever. None of it could stabilize his blood pressure. Dr. Chibuzo examined every monitor again. Something still didn't fit. The numbers changed too rapidly. His pupils reacted normally, then abnormally. His breathing improved, then worsened. His heartbeat accelerated, then suddenly slowed. It was as though several different illnesses were appearing one after another. "I've never seen anything like this," he whispered. Tunde's radio interrupted. "Another hospital has agreed to evaluate him." The convoy immediately changed direction. Hope returned once more, only to disappear again. When they reached the third hospital, security gates remained closed. Hospital guards stood outside waiting. One administrator approached the convoy, but refused to step closer. He handed Tunde a printed document. "We regret," Tunde interrupted angrily. "Don't read from a paper. Open the gate. We've been instructed not to." "Who instructed you?" "I cannot disclose that." Inside the ambulance, Dr. Chibuzo slammed his fist against a cabinet. "This is insanity." Aderonke closed her eyes. For the first time that day, she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, only silent tears rolling down her face while she continued holding her husband's hand. She remembered the young man she had married decades earlier. He had owned one second-hand shirt, one worn pair of shoes, a dream larger than his circumstances. She remembered nights when they shared a single meal because they couldn't afford another. She remembered him promising that if success ever came, he would never allow money to change his heart. He had kept that promise. Now, money could not buy him a hospital bed. Hours passed. Every road seemed longer than the last. The medical team grew increasingly exhausted. Portable medications were running low. Even oxygen supplies would not last forever. Late that afternoon, the convoy slowed near a small roadside market, while Tunde coordinated yet another route. Vendors watched curiously as the expensive vehicles stopped beneath a large acacia tree. Among them was a young woman carrying a woven basket filled with herbs, clean bandages, and handmade soap. Her name was Yetunde Akinola, 24 years old. Raised in a quiet farming village several kilometers away, she had come to the market to buy rice for her elderly neighbors. As people gathered around discussing the convoy, fragments of conversation reached her ears. They say it's the billionaire. No hospital will treat him. They've tried everywhere. Yetunde looked toward the ambulance. Something inside her urged her to walk closer. She did not know Olalekan Adeyemi. She had never seen him in person. But one lesson from her late grandmother echoed clearly in her mind. When everyone starts looking at titles instead of the patient, someone must still look at the person. Without fully understanding why, Yetunde set down her basket. Then she quietly began walking toward the ambulance, unaware that the next few minutes would change both her life and the future of an entire nation. The first thing Yetunde Akinola remembered whenever fear entered her heart was her grandmother's voice. Never let someone's clothing tell you whether they deserve your attention. It was a lesson Mama Folake had repeated countless times while treating injured farmers, sick children, and exhausted mothers in their small village. Years before anyone had ever heard the name Olalekan Adeyemi, Yetunde had grown up in a modest mud brick house on the outskirts of Ogun State. The roof leaked during the rainy season. The electricity disappeared more often than it stayed. Their drinking water came from a hand pump nearly half a kilometer away. They had very little, but no one who knocked on Mama Folake's door ever left without help. Some arrived with cuts from farm tools. Others carried children burning with fever while waiting for transportation to the nearest clinic. Pregnant women often came seeking reassurance before long journeys to district hospitals. Mama Folake never claimed to replace doctors. In fact, she admired them deeply. If a patient needs a hospital, she often told Yetunde, our duty is to help them reach one alive. That distinction shaped Yetunde's entire childhood. Her grandmother believed traditional knowledge had value, but only when guided by humility, observation, and respect for modern medicine. She refused dangerous superstitions. She rejected miracle claims. She never promised impossible cures. Instead, she taught practical skills: how to recognize dangerous dehydration, how to stop severe bleeding until professional help arrived, how to keep an unconscious person breathing safely, how to calm frightened families so panic would not become another emergency. Most importantly, she taught Yetunde how to observe. When others look, Mama Folake would say, you must learn to see. At first, Yetunde never understood the difference. Then, one afternoon, when she was only 11 years old, a farmer stumbled into their yard after collapsing in his field. Several neighbors insisted he had been cursed. Mama Folake ignored every rumor. She knelt beside the man, quietly studying him without saying a word. She noticed dirt beneath one fingernail. She smelled pesticide on his clothes. She observed unusually small pupils. Within seconds, she turned to the villagers. Stop arguing. He needs clean air immediately. She instructed everyone to remove his contaminated shirt, rinse his skin with water, and call for an ambulance. Hours later, hospital doctors confirmed pesticide poisoning. The farmer survived. That evening, Yetunde finally understood. Everyone had looked. Only her grandmother had truly seen. From that day forward, Yetunde watched everything. She noticed tiny details other people ignored: a trembling hand, uneven breathing, a child's unusual silence, an elderly woman's confused expression. Nothing escaped her attention. When she finished secondary school, several teachers encouraged her to study nursing. She dreamed of it. She worked harder than anyone in her class, but dreams often cost more than hope. After Mama Folake developed kidney disease, every savings account disappeared into medical bills. Yetunde sold vegetables before school. She braided hair on weekends. She cleaned classrooms during holidays. Still, it wasn't enough. University became impossible. When Mama Folake passed away peacefully 2 years later, Yetunde buried not only the woman who raised her, she buried the future she had imagined. Many expected her to leave the village in search of work. Instead, she stayed. Not because she lacked ambition, because the people needed someone. The nearest government clinic was almost 40 kilometers away. During heavy rains, the road became nearly impassable. Pregnant mothers sometimes traveled for hours before reaching professional care. Children with simple infections often became critically ill because treatment came too late. Yetunde could not change the healthcare system, but she refused to abandon the people around her. She organized first aid lessons beneath the old baobab tree every Saturday. She taught teenagers how to recognize emergencies. She showed parents how to keep wounds clean. She encouraged every family to seek qualified medical care whenever possible. Some villagers affectionately began calling her Dr. Yetunde. Every time she heard it, she smiled and corrected them. "I'm not a doctor. I'm only someone still learning." That humility earned respect throughout neighboring villages. Even licensed nurses who occasionally visited appreciated her honesty. One nurse named Ifeoma once asked, "Why don't you pretend to know more? People would admire you." Yetunde laughed. "A wrong answer can cost someone their life. I'd rather admit what I don't know." Those words stayed with Nurse Ifeoma for years. On the morning Olalekan collapsed, Yetunde had awakened before sunrise. She prepared breakfast for 2 elderly widows who lived nearby. Afterward, she gathered clean bandages she had sewn herself, herbal teas for minor stomach discomfort, bars of homemade soap, and basic first aid supplies. Everything fit neatly inside one woven basket. The village market was nearly an hour away on foot. Along the road, she greeted almost everyone by name: an old fisherman, school children, a pregnant woman expecting twins, a mechanic repairing a motorcycle beneath a tree. She belonged there, not because she was wealthy, but because people trusted her. By midday, she had sold enough soap and vegetables to buy rice, cooking oil, and medicine for several elderly neighbors. She was preparing to leave when shouting erupted near the highway. A convoy of expensive black vehicles had stopped not far from the market. People rushed toward the scene. Speculation spread instantly. "Maybe it's a government minister." "No, I heard it's someone famous." "Oh, they say he's dying." Another vendor pulled out his phone. "It's Olalekan Adeyemi, the billionaire." Yetunde had heard the name many times. She remembered reading newspaper stories about scholarships for poor students, new clinics, libraries, agricultural loans. Her own village school had received donated textbooks from the Adeyemi Foundation several years earlier. She quietly looked toward the convoy. Something felt unusual, not because the patient was famous, because the behavior surrounding the ambulance seemed wrong. Medical staff appeared exhausted. Security officers looked increasingly desperate. Family members were standing helplessly outside. No one displayed the focused rhythm she usually associated with coordinated emergency care. Instead, she saw confusion, fear, uncertainty. She instinctively moved closer, staying respectfully behind the growing crowd. She watched silently. No assumptions, no interruptions, just observation. The ambulance doors opened briefly, only for a moment. Yet that moment was enough. She noticed their patient, his breathing, the position of his head, the movement of the doctors, the expressions on their faces. Then she noticed something else, something so small that almost everyone nearby overlooked it. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't immediately understand what it meant, but she knew one thing: it deserved another look. Without realizing it, she took a single step forward, then another. Nearby, Security Chief Yetunde Balogun spotted the young village woman approaching the ambulance with her simple woven basket. He immediately raised one hand. "Stop right there." The crowd fell silent. Yetunde stopped exactly where she stood. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't offended. She simply looked toward the unconscious man inside the ambulance with quiet concern. Deep inside, the final lesson Mama Folake had ever taught her echoed once again. Sometimes the smallest detail decides whether a person lives long enough to reach tomorrow. Yetunde had no idea that within the next few minutes, that lesson would be tested more than ever before. The marketplace fell unusually quiet. Only minutes earlier, vendors had been calling out prices for tomatoes, peppers, and roasted corn. Children had been laughing near a fruit stand. Motorcycles buzzed along the roadside. Now, everyone watched the ambulance. Yetunde remained exactly where Security Chief Tunde Balogun had ordered her to stop. She made no attempt to argue. Instead, she lowered her basket gently onto the ground. Inside were neatly folded sterile gauze bottles of clean water, handmade soap, a small first aid pouch, and several individually wrapped sterile needles that Nurse Ifeoma from the district clinic had given her months earlier during a community health workshop. Nothing extraordinary, nothing mysterious. Just simple medical supplies for emergencies in villages where ambulances often arrived too late. Tunde walked toward her cautiously. He was a tall man in his early 40s whose entire career had been built on eliminating risk before it reached the people under his protection. Every stranger represented uncertainty, and uncertainty could kill. His eyes quickly examined Yetunde. Simple cotton dress, worn sandals, no identification badge, no hospital uniform, no medical credentials. Nothing about her suggested she belonged anywhere near Nigeria's most influential businessman. "Who are you?" he asked firmly. "My name is Yetunde Akinola. What do you want?" She glanced toward the ambulance. "I'd like to see the patient." Several people nearby exchanged confused looks. One security officer almost laughed. "You?" Yetunde nodded, calmly. "I only need a few seconds." Tunde folded his arms. "The patient already has specialists." "I know." "Then why would he need you?" she answered honestly. "I don't know if he does." The unexpected reply caught him off guard. She hadn't claimed she could save anyone. She hadn't introduced herself as a miracle worker. She simply stood there speaking with surprising humility. Still, this was not the time to entertain strangers. "I'm sorry," Tunde said. "You need to leave." Yetunde remained respectful. "I understand." She bent down to pick up her basket. Then she looked once more toward the ambulance. "May I ask one question?" Tunde hesitated. "One." "Has his condition been changing very quickly?" His expression shifted slightly. "How would you know that?" "I watched your doctor's face." "What about it?" "He looks confused." Tunde said nothing. She continued quietly. "A doctor usually looks focused when the diagnosis is clear. He keeps checking the monitor instead of the patient. That tells me the symptoms aren't matching what he expected." Tunde stared at her for several seconds. She wasn't guessing wildly. She had simply observed. Before he could respond, Dr. Chibuzo climbed out of the ambulance. His shirt was damp with sweat. His normally composed face showed unmistakable exhaustion. Tunde immediately approached him. "Doctor." He glanced toward Yetunde. "This young woman says she noticed something." Dr. Chibuzo looked at Yetunde briefly before shaking his head. "We don't have time." Yetunde bowed her head respectfully. "I understand." She turned to leave. Then, the cardiac monitor inside the ambulance emitted another sharp warning tone. One of the nurses shouted, "Doctor!" Everyone rushed back toward the vehicle. Olalekan's breathing had become dangerously shallow again. His oxygen saturation was falling despite continuous support. Dr. Chibuzo immediately checked the equipment. The oxygen line worked perfectly. The medications were correct. Nothing explained the sudden decline. Aderonke's voice trembled. "What's happening?" "I don't know." For the second time that day, the doctor admitted the words he hated most. Outside, Yetunde stopped walking. She looked back, not because she wanted recognition, because she could see panic replacing clear thinking. Mama Folek's voice echoed in her memory. When fear enters the room, observation usually leaves first. Without crossing the security line, Yetunde spoke loudly enough for Dr. Chibuzo to hear. "Doctor." He barely looked up. "What? May I ask another question?" His patience was nearly gone. "This isn't the time. It will take 5 seconds." Aderonke suddenly spoke. "Let her ask." Everyone looked toward her. She had spent hours watching specialists struggle. One simple question could hardly make things worse. Dr. Chibuzo nodded impatiently. 5 seconds. Yetunde asked, "When he collapsed, did he lose consciousness before or after he struggled to breathe?" The doctor frowned. "What? The order matters." Dr. Chibuzo thought back. The entire event had happened so quickly. Then he realized he wasn't completely sure. He immediately questioned one of the nurses. "You were watching him first. What happened?" The nurse answered. "He stopped talking, looked confused, then became dizzy, and only afterward his breathing worsened." Yetunde nodded slowly. She had expected that answer. Dr. Chibuzo looked at her more carefully now. "Why does that matter?" "I don't know yet. But it may." Several physicians standing nearby exchanged skeptical glances. One senior consultant from the nearby hospital whispered, "This is ridiculous." Another added, "We're wasting valuable time." Yetunde heard both comments. She ignored them. Instead, she asked another question. "Has anyone examined the back of his neck since he collapsed?" The consultant almost scoffed. "What difference would that make?" "I don't know." "I'd simply like to know." Dr. Chibuzo paused. In truth, no one had. Everything had focused on his heart, his lungs, his blood pressure, laboratory values, portable monitoring. No one had performed another complete physical examination after leaving the first hospital. He climbed back inside. Carefully, he repositioned Olalekan's head. Then he examined the neck. Behind one ear, barely visible beneath the hairline, he noticed something. A tiny swollen point, almost insignificant, no larger than the head of a pin. Dr. Chibuzo leaned closer. "What?" He gently touched the surrounding skin. Slight warmth, mild swelling, nothing dramatic. Yet, he was certain it hadn't been documented earlier. He immediately looked toward Yetunde through the open ambulance doors. "What made you ask that?" She answered truthfully. "When the doors opened earlier, I thought I saw him react when his head touched the pillow. I wasn't certain. So, I wondered if something had been missed." For the first time all afternoon, nobody dismissed her. The consultant stepped closer. "It could be nothing." Dr. Chibuzo nodded. "It could. But we've been saying that about everything." He carefully continued examining the area. The tiny mark resembled a puncture, not an injection site, not a cut. Something else. He immediately began considering entirely new possibilities. Meanwhile, Olalekan suddenly gasped. His fingers twitched violently. The monitor alarms intensified again. Aderonke grabbed the doctor's arm. "Please, do something." Dr. Chibuzo looked from the monitor to the tiny mark, then toward Yetunde. His years of medical training told him never to trust assumptions. His experience told him fresh eyes sometimes noticed overlooked details. He stepped out of the ambulance and walked directly toward Yetunde. "What exactly do you think you've seen?" She answered carefully. "I don't know enough to give conclusions. I only know I would like 1 minute beside the patient." Several doctors protested immediately. Impossible. Absolutely not. This is unacceptable. Security officers looked toward Tunde, waiting for instructions. The marketplace held its breath. 1 minute. That was all the unknown village girl was asking for. 1 minute. To look at the man every hospital had failed to save so far. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The afternoon heat seemed to press down on everyone gathered around the ambulance. Vendors had stopped selling. Drivers had stepped out of their vehicles. Even children who had been playing nearby stood silently behind their parents, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Dr. Chibuzo looked at Yetunde, then at Olalekan, then back again. His medical training warned him against allowing an unlicensed civilian near a critically ill patient. His conscience reminded him of another reality. Everything they had tried was failing. Aderonke stepped forward. If she only wants 1 minute. She looked directly into the doctor's eyes. What exactly do we have left to lose? The words landed heavily. One of the senior consultants immediately objected. This is completely against protocol. Dr. Chibuzo answered without looking at him. So is transporting an unstable patient from hospital to hospital because no one will admit him. The consultant fell silent. Tunde Balogun remained cautious. My responsibility is Mr. Adeyemi's safety. Yetunde nodded. And you should continue doing that. She held both hands up calmly. You may search everything I have. My basket, my pockets, my supplies. If you are uncomfortable at any moment, I will step away immediately. Her calm confidence surprised everyone. She wasn't demanding trust, she was earning it. Tunde carefully examined her basket. Every item inside was ordinary. Clean gauze, alcohol wipes, medical tape, scissors, a blood pressure notebook, disposable gloves, several individually sealed sterile needles. Nothing dangerous, nothing suspicious. He even inspected the cloth pouch twice. Finally, he nodded. Everything is clean. Yetunde quietly put on a pair of disposable gloves. She sanitized her hands. Then she looked toward Dr. Chibuzo. May I? He hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. You have 1 minute. No more. Yetunde climbed carefully into the ambulance. She ignored the expensive equipment surrounding Olalekan. She ignored the anxious family. She ignored the crowd watching from outside. Instead, she looked only at the patient, exactly as Mama Folake had taught her. Observe first, think second, act last. She noticed the rhythm of his breathing, uneven. She noticed tiny muscle movements beneath one eyelid. She noticed his skin color, his fingertips, the position of his jaw. Then her eyes settled once more on the tiny swollen mark behind his ear. She leaned closer, not touching, simply looking. Dr. Chibuzo watched every movement. You've seen something. Yetunde answered softly. I've seen a question. What question? Did anyone ask whether he was bitten by anything today? The doctors exchanged puzzled looks. A bite. What kind of bite? I don't know. I'm asking. Dr. Chibuzo immediately questioned Tunde. Has Mr. Adeyemi been outdoors today? Yes. For several hours. Any insects? Many. Mosquitoes. Bees. Flies. Nothing unusual. Another security officer suddenly interrupted. Wait, everyone turned. I remember something. What? This morning, while Mr. Adeyemi was inspecting irrigation equipment, he suddenly touched the side of his neck. I asked if everything was all right. He smiled. Said something had stung him. The officer frowned. I didn't think anything of it. Dr. Chibuzo looked sharply toward Yetunde. She remained thoughtful. I'm still not certain, but I think that detail matters. The consultant crossed his arms. People are bitten by insects every day. Exactly, Yetunde replied, but most don't collapse. The doctor had no immediate answer. Yetunde gently examined the surrounding skin without applying pressure. The swelling remained localized. She looked toward Dr. Chibuzo. Has he received medication for an allergic reaction? Yes. No significant improvement. She nodded. Has his heart been treated? Yes. No lasting improvement. She paused. Have his symptoms kept changing? Constantly. She looked back at the tiny puncture. Then she quietly said, I don't think you've been treating the wrong patient. I think you've been treating the wrong problem. The words settled over the ambulance. Dr. Chibuzo immediately reconsidered every symptom from the beginning. Sudden confusion, collapse, rapid changes, unstable blood pressure, inconsistent response to medication, the tiny puncture. Something clicked. Not a diagnosis, a direction. He immediately turned to one of the nurses. I need the regional poison control center. The nurse blinked. Poison. I said call them. Within moments the phone was connected. Dr. Chibuzo rapidly described every symptom. The specialist on the other end listened carefully, then asked one unexpected question. Is there evidence of a sting or puncture? Dr. Chibuzo looked at Yetunde. Yes, there is, the specialist continued. Certain venomous insects and arthropods can produce highly variable cardiovascular symptoms. I'm not confirming that's the cause, but you should immediately begin evaluating that possibility. Dr. Chibuzo closed his eyes for a brief second. How had he overlooked it? Not because he lacked knowledge, because everyone, including himself, had focused first on the obvious. Heart attack, stroke, cardiac failure. Nobody had stepped back. Nobody had restarted the investigation from the beginning. Yetunde quietly removed her gloves. She reached into her pouch and removed one sealed, sterile acupuncture-style needle. She held it out without opening the package. I am not asking to treat him alone. She looked directly at Dr. Chibuzo. But if you believe the airway muscles are tightening, there is a pressure point my grandmother taught me. It does not replace medicine. It simply helps some patients maintain muscle relaxation while treatment begins. The consultant immediately objected. That's traditional practice. Yetunde calmly corrected him. No. It's physical stimulation. If you disagree, please don't use it. She placed the unopened package back into her basket. Dr. Chibuzo thought carefully. The technique itself posed almost no risk if performed correctly. More importantly, it would never replace proper medical care. He turned toward the poison specialist still waiting on the phone. While arranging transport, we're attempting supportive measures. The specialist answered, maintain breathing, maintain circulation. Anything low risk that helps stabilize him while reaching definitive treatment is reasonable. Dr. Chibuzo looked at Yetunde. Show me. She immediately shook her head. No. The doctors looked surprised. You should do it. I'll guide your hand. He understood instantly. She wasn't trying to become the hero. She wanted the physician to remain responsible for the patient's care. Together, they carefully prepared the sterile needle. Yetunde identified the precise location on Olalekan's forearm. Not deep. Very gentle. Dr. Chibuzo followed her instructions exactly. A brief stimulation. Only seconds. Nothing dramatic happened. No miracle, no glowing lights, no instant recovery. The consultant almost sighed in frustration. Then, the monitor emitted a different tone. The nurse looked up. "Doctor, oxygen saturation. It's climbing. 90, 92, 94. Olalekan's chest movements became less strained. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His breathing, though still fragile, grew noticeably more regular. Dr. Chibuzo immediately checked the airway again. "Continue oxygen. Keep monitoring. No one stop." Another nurse called out. "Blood pressure is improving." Only slightly. But it was improving. Aderonki covered her mouth with both hands. Tears streamed down her face. Not because her husband was suddenly safe. He wasn't. But for the first time since the collapse, his condition had stopped getting worse. Dr. Chibuzo slowly looked toward Yetunde. "You didn't save him." She smiled gently. "I know. You helped us think." She lowered her eyes. "That's enough." The doctor nodded. "No." He glanced at the steadily improving monitor. "It may have been exactly what we needed." Far away, another hospital had just received urgent new information. This time, the doctors inside were preparing very differently. The ambulance was moving again. This time the atmosphere inside was different. Not because anyone believed Olalekan Adeyemi was out of danger. He wasn't. Every monitor still displayed numbers that demanded constant attention. His blood pressure remained unstable, and his breathing still required oxygen support. But for the first time since he had collapsed, there was measurable improvement instead of relentless decline. Dr. Chibuzo refused to celebrate. He had seen patients improve briefly before deteriorating again. "Keep monitoring every 30 seconds, he instructed the nurses. "No assumptions. Record every change." One nurse nodded while documenting the readings. "Blood pressure is slowly rising. Pulse is becoming more regular. Oxygen saturation holding at 95%. Dr. Chibuzo looked toward Yetunde, who sat quietly near the rear doors of the ambulance after being invited to remain during the transfer. She wasn't watching the monitors. She wasn't trying to direct anyone. She simply observed Olalekan's face. That caught the doctor's attention. "You aren't looking at the equipment." Yetunde smiled politely. "The machines are your responsibility. The patient is everyone's responsibility." For a brief moment, Dr. Chibuzo simply looked at her. Years of medical school, residency, international conferences, advanced emergency training. Yet one sentence from a young village woman reminded him why he had chosen medicine in the first place. He nodded slowly. "You're right." Outside, the convoy accelerated toward the Federal University Teaching Hospital in Abeokuta. Unlike the previous facilities, this hospital had already been informed that Dr. Chibuzo suspected an uncommon toxic reaction, rather than an ordinary cardiac emergency. Instead of rejecting the patient outright, the emergency department began preparing specialized equipment before the convoy even arrived. Inside the hospital, Professor Ibrahim Suleiman, head of emergency medicine, stood reviewing every piece of information transmitted during the journey. He was one of Nigeria's leading emergency physicians. His reputation had been built on one principle: treat evidence, not assumptions. When he reached the final report, one sentence immediately caught his attention. "Village woman observed overlooked puncture site." Professor Ibrahim looked toward his colleagues. "Who wrote this?" One resident answered, "Dr. Chibuzo." The professor nodded. "Good." No one laughed. No one dismissed the observation simply because it came from someone without a medical degree. Instead, he asked, "Has anyone photographed the puncture?" "No." "Prepare high-resolution imaging." "What anti-venom supplies do we currently have?" The pharmacy immediately responded. The emergency department transformed into organized motion. 40 minutes later, The convoy entered the hospital grounds. This time, the gates were already open. Doctors were waiting outside. No administrator blocked the entrance. No paperwork delayed treatment. No one asked who would accept responsibility. The stretcher rolled directly into the emergency department. Professor Ibrahim met Dr. Chibuzo halfway down the corridor. "Give me everything." Dr. Chibuzo summarized the entire case in less than 2 minutes. Rapid collapse, changing symptoms, 3 hospital refusals, tiny puncture behind the ear, gradual stabilization after supportive treatment and reassessment. Professor Ibrahim listened without interrupting. Then he turned toward Yetunde. "You were the one who noticed the puncture." She lowered her head respectfully. "Yes, Professor." "You concluded it was venom." "No, sir. I concluded we hadn't asked enough questions." The professor smiled slightly. "Excellent answer." Several younger doctors looked surprised. They had expected him to dismiss her. Instead, he turned to his team. "Remember that. A careful question is often more valuable than a confident answer." Olalekan was transferred onto a hospital bed. Ultrasound, advanced blood work, continuous cardiac monitoring, neurological assessment, toxicology consultation. Everything happened with remarkable efficiency. Yetunde quietly stepped backward. Her work, as far as she was concerned, had ended. She began gathering her small basket. Aderonke noticed. "Where are you going?" "Home." "You can't leave." "I should." "You've done enough." Aderonke gently held her hand. "No. You've done more than enough. I don't even know how to thank you." Yetunde smiled. "You already have." "When?" "You trusted someone nobody else trusted." Before Aderonke could answer, Professor Ibrahim called everyone toward the imaging screen. "The puncture is confirmed." The enlarged image clearly showed a tiny bite mark surrounded by localized tissue reaction. One toxicologist adjusted his glasses. "This resembles a venomous arthropod sting." Another physician added, "The cardiovascular symptoms are consistent." Dr. Chibuzo exhaled slowly. "So, we weren't treating a primary heart attack?" "No." Professor Ibrahim shook his head. His heart was reacting. It wasn't the original problem. The consultant who had criticized Yetunde earlier quietly lowered his eyes. No one blamed him. Medicine was filled with uncertainty. But everyone recognized one uncomfortable truth. Without Yetunde, they might never have reconsidered the diagnosis. Hours passed. The hospital staff administered targeted treatment while continuously observing Olalekan's response. Near sunset, a nurse suddenly smiled. "Professor." He opened his eyes. Everyone hurried to the bedside. Olalekan blinked several times, clearly confused. His voice was barely audible. "Where?" Professor Ibrahim leaned closer. "You're safe. You've been through a serious medical emergency." Olalekan looked around slowly. He recognized Aderonke first, then Dr. Chibuzo. Finally, his eyes settled on Yetunde, standing quietly near the doorway, almost hidden behind several nurses. He frowned gently. "I know everyone here." His voice remained weak. "Except her." Aderonke wiped fresh tears from her face. "Her name is Yetunde. She helped save your life." Olalekan looked toward Yetunde. She immediately shook her head. "No. The doctors saved your life. I only asked questions." Professor Ibrahim smiled. "And they happened to be the right questions." Olalekan studied her for several seconds. Despite his weakness, he noticed something unusual. She wasn't trying to stand closer. She wasn't asking for recognition. She wasn't taking photographs. She wasn't speaking to reporters gathering outside. Instead, She looked almost uncomfortable receiving attention. "What do you do?" he asked softly. Yetunde hesitated. "I help people in my village." "Are you a nurse?" "No." "A doctor?" "No." "A medical student?" She smiled gently. "I wish." The room became quiet. Olalekan looked toward Professor Ibrahim. "What is she?" The professor answered without hesitation. "Someone who paid attention." Those 4 words remained in the room long after nobody spoke. Late that evening, preliminary laboratory findings began arriving. Several markers strongly supported the team's new direction. The toxicology consultant reviewed the results twice before speaking. "The evidence is becoming convincing." This was almost certainly a severe venom-induced systemic reaction. Dr. Chibuzo leaned back against the wall. Months of experience told him how close they had come to losing his patient. Not because modern medicine had failed, but because everyone, including himself, had initially followed the most obvious explanation, instead of continuing to question it. Outside the hospital, journalists waited behind security barriers. Rumors spread rapidly across Nigeria. The billionaire has regained consciousness. The mystery illness may finally be explained. But another story was beginning to spread as well. People whispered about an unknown young woman from a rural village who had noticed what every expert had overlooked. By sunrise, the entire country would want to know one name: Yetunde Akinola. Before dawn broke over Abeokuta, the quiet corridors of the Federal University Teaching Hospital were already crowded. Journalists waited outside the main entrance. Television vans lined the street. Hospital security officers struggled to keep reporters behind the barriers. Every major news station carried the same headline. Why was Nigeria's most respected billionaire turned away by multiple hospitals? Inside the intensive care unit, however, nobody was thinking about headlines. Olalekan Adeyemi was finally sleeping peacefully. His blood pressure had continued improving throughout the night. His breathing had stabilized enough for the oxygen flow to be reduced. Dr. Chibuzo reviewed every laboratory result that had arrived since midnight. The toxicology panel, blood chemistry, cardiac markers, neurological assessments. Each new report supported the same conclusion. The venom-triggered systemic reaction had placed extraordinary stress on Olalekan's cardiovascular system, creating symptoms that initially resembled several different medical emergencies. Professor Ibrahim folded his arms. "We've identified the immediate cause." "Yes, but another question remains." Dr. Chibuzo looked up. "Why was treatment delayed for so many hours?" Neither man answered. They both already suspected the answer would be far more disturbing than the diagnosis itself. Just after 8 o'clock, officials from the Federal Ministry of Health arrived. They weren't there to congratulate anyone. They wanted explanations. Deputy Minister Dr. Hadiza Musa entered the conference room carrying a thick folder. Around the table sat hospital administrators, emergency physicians, legal advisors, and representatives from the National Medical Council. Professor Ibrahim began calmly. "Our patient is stable. Now we need to understand everything that happened before he reached this hospital." The meeting started with a simple timeline. 8:15 a.m., Olalekan collapsed. 8:31 a.m., first hospital contacted. Admission refused. 9:12 a.m., second hospital. Transfer recommended without examination. 10:05 a.m., third hospital. Gate never opened. Every event had been documented. Radio recordings, phone logs, vehicle GPS records, ambulance monitor data. Nothing had been lost. Dr. Hadiza looked toward the investigators. "I want the administrators from each hospital interviewed today." One legal officer nodded. "They're already waiting." The first administrator entered. He looked exhausted. Professor Ibrahim asked gently, "Why did your hospital refuse the patient?" The administrator hesitated. "Our ICU," Professor Ibrahim interrupted. "We've already inspected your ICU. There were available beds." Silence. The administrator swallowed. "Our legal department advised caution." "Why, we feared—" Another pause. "If Mr. Adeyemi died in our facility, the hospital would face enormous lawsuits." The room became quiet. One investigator wrote carefully, "Fear, not lack of equipment. Fear." The second administrator entered. His explanation sounded different. Yet, somehow, it wasn't. "Our specialists weren't available." Professor Ibrahim opened another document. They were present. The administrator looked away. "We believed transfer to Lagos would offer better care." Dr. Chibuzo spoke calmly. "You knew he wouldn't survive that journey." No answer came. Then came the third administrator. Unlike the others, he looked deeply ashamed before anyone asked a question. "I'd like to apologize." Professor Ibrahim nodded. "Please explain." The man took a deep breath. "We received several phone calls." "From whom?" He hesitated. "I don't know. The callers never identified themselves." "What did they say?" "They warned us not to accept responsibility." "Why?" "They claimed powerful people were already monitoring the situation." Several investigators exchanged glances. This was becoming far more serious. Dr. Hadiza leaned forward. "Did they threaten you?" The administrator nodded slowly. "They said, if anything happened to Mr. Adeyemi inside our hospital, our licenses, funding, and careers would be destroyed." The conference room fell silent. Nobody spoke for nearly 20 seconds. Finally, Professor Ibrahim broke the silence. "So, medical decisions were influenced by intimidation." The administrator lowered his head. "Yes." Meanwhile, across the hospital, Yetunde sat quietly beneath a mango tree outside the staff cafeteria. She still wore the same simple dress from the previous day. She had refused every television interview. She ignored reporters asking for photographs. Instead, she was sharing breakfast with one of the cleaners. An elderly woman named Mama Esther smiled warmly. "My grandchildren watched you on television." Yetunde nearly choked on her tea. "I was on television." Mama Esther laughed. "Every station." Yetunde covered her face. "Oh no. You don't like attention." She smiled awkwardly. "I came to buy rice yesterday. I wasn't expecting any of this." Mama Esther shook her head affectionately. Maybe God had other plans. Before Yetunde could answer, Aderonke approached carrying 2 cups of tea. "May I sit with you?" "Of course." The billionaire's wife quietly sat beside the village girl. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Finally, Aderonke asked, "Were you frightened yesterday?" Yetunde considered the question carefully. "Yes." "Very." "You didn't look frightened." "My grandmother always said, patients borrow courage from the people around them. If I showed fear, everyone else would become more afraid." Aderonke smiled through moist eyes. "I'll never forget that." Across the courtyard, Olalekan was awake again. His condition continued improving steadily. Professor Ibrahim entered his room carrying updated reports. "How are you feeling today?" "Weak, but alive." The professor smiled. "That's encouraging." Olalekan looked toward the window. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "The hospitals." Professor Ibrahim remained silent. Olalekan continued. "I've spent years donating equipment, buildings, scholarships. If everything we've built can still produce yesterday, Then we've missed something much bigger. The professor nodded slowly. I believe you're right. Later that afternoon, another development shocked everyone. The National Emergency Communications Authority released audio recordings from the ambulance radio. The public heard every desperate request for admission, every refusal, every delay, every unnecessary transfer. Radio presenters across Nigeria played the recordings repeatedly. Public anger exploded. Phone lines flooded with callers sharing their own stories. A mother described losing her son after waiting 6 hours for treatment. An elderly farmer spoke about being transferred between 3 hospitals before dying. Relatives finally reached one that accepted them. A pregnant teacher recalled giving birth in a parking lot after being refused because no beds were available. The stories kept coming. By evening, it had become painfully clear. Olalekan's experience was not unique. The only difference, he survived. Because the entire nation knew his name. Thousands of ordinary people never received that second chance. That realization haunted Olalekan more than his illness. Late that evening, he asked Aderonke to wheel him toward the hospital garden. The setting sun painted the sky orange. Nearby, Yetunde was teaching 2 young nurses how Mama Folake used to organize emergency first aid lessons for villagers before ambulances arrived. She wasn't lecturing. She wasn't claiming expertise. She simply shared practical ideas that encouraged communities to recognize danger early and seek professional help faster. Olalekan watched quietly. After several minutes, he spoke. You could have asked me for anything. Yetunde looked surprised. I didn't save your life for a reward. I know. Then why did you help me? She answered without hesitation. Because yesterday, you weren't a billionaire. You were someone's husband, someone's father, someone's patient, and that was enough. Olalekan lowered his eyes. Those words struck him more deeply than any newspaper headline ever could. At that very moment, hundreds of kilometers away in Lagos, a powerful businessman watched the evening news in complete silence. When Yetunde's face appeared on the television screen, his expression hardened. He reached for his phone. We have a problem, he said quietly. That girl noticed something she was never supposed to notice. The person on the other end replied, What do you want us to do? The businessman stared at the television for several more seconds before answering. Find out everything about Yetunde Akinola, and make sure she stops asking questions. The next morning, Yetunde Akinola woke before sunrise on a narrow hospital visitor's cot. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ambulance parked beneath the acacia tree, heard the frantic beeping of the cardiac monitor, and remembered the look on Aderonke's face as she wondered whether her husband would survive another hour. Yetunde quietly folded the thin blanket, washed her face, and prepared to leave before anyone noticed. She had no reason to remain. Olalekan was recovering. The doctors had identified the cause of his illness. Her elderly neighbors back in the village would be wondering where she had disappeared to. She picked up her woven basket, now much lighter than before, and walked toward the hospital entrance. She had almost reached the gate when she heard someone call her name. Miss Yetunde. She turned. One of the hospital receptionists came running toward her. Please don't leave yet. Mrs. Adeyemi is looking for you. Yetunde smiled politely. Please thank her for everything. But I really need to go home. I'm afraid she insisted. Before Yetunde could answer, a black SUV slowly entered the hospital courtyard. Several reporters immediately rushed toward it, believing Olalekan was leaving. Instead, Aderonke stepped out alone. The journalists instantly surrounded her. Mrs. Adeyemi, is your husband recovering? Is it true a village girl saved his life? Will your family reward her? Aderonke raised one hand. My husband is improving. We're grateful to every doctor, nurse, and healthcare worker who fought for him. And yes, she looked toward Yetunde, standing quietly near the entrance. We are especially grateful to the young woman who refused to ignore what everyone else overlooked. Dozens of cameras immediately turned toward Yetunde. Flash after flash illuminated her face. She instinctively stepped backward. This was the last place she wanted to be. A reporter hurried closer. "Miss Yetunde, how did you know what the doctors missed?" She answered honestly, "I didn't. I simply asked questions." Another reporter interrupted. "People are calling you a miracle healer." Yetunde immediately shook her head. "No, please don't say that. I am not a healer. I am not a doctor." I was fortunate enough to notice one detail. The hospital doctors saved Mr. Adeyemi. Her answer disappointed several journalists, hoping for a sensational headline. One producer whispered to another, "That's not dramatic enough." Yetunde overheard him, but said nothing. Aderonke gently guided her toward the waiting vehicle. "Let's get away from all of this." Inside the SUV, Yetunde looked uncomfortable. "I've never spoken to journalists before." Aderonke smiled. "I noticed. They ask so many questions. They always will. But you answered well. I only told the truth." Aderonke looked out the window thoughtfully. "That's exactly why people will believe you." Meanwhile, inside a luxury office tower in Lagos, Chief Raymond Bassi switched off the television. The 59-year-old businessman controlled several private healthcare investment companies across Nigeria. For years, he had quietly influenced hospital boards through financial partnerships and political connections. He had never expected a medical emergency involving Olalekan Adeyemi to become national news. What troubled him even more was Yetunde. He replayed one particular television clip. "I simply asked questions." Raymond frowned. Questions. Simple questions often destroyed complicated lies. He pressed the intercom. "Send Mr. Cole in." A few moments later, a sharply dressed man entered. "You wanted to see me, sir." Raymond pointed toward the television screen. "I want a complete background report." "On whom?" "The village girl." Cole looked surprised. "She doesn't seem dangerous." Raymond answered quietly. "People who don't seek power are often the hardest to control." Back at the hospital, Olalekan had been moved from intensive care to a private recovery suite. Although still weak, he insisted on reading every newspaper delivered that morning. The headlines disturbed him. "Billionaire saved by village miracle." "Poor girl outsmarts Nigeria's best doctors." He placed the papers aside. "They've misunderstood everything." Professor Ibrahim entered carrying updated medical reports. "Good morning." Olalekan pointed toward the newspapers. "These stories will hurt people." "How so?" "They make it sound as though medicine failed." The professor nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. The truth is, medicine succeeded. It simply succeeded because someone reminded us to keep questioning." Olalekan smiled faintly. "Exactly. We cannot allow people to believe they should choose stories over science." Professor Ibrahim appreciated the statement. It confirmed the kind of man Olalekan truly was. Later that afternoon, Yetunde finally prepared to leave the hospital. Several nurses hugged her goodbye. Mama Esther packed fresh bread and fruit into her basket. Even the security guards waved warmly as she walked toward the bus station. She felt relieved. Soon, everything would return to normal. Or so she believed. The bus reached her village just before sunset. Children immediately ran toward her. "Sister Yetunde, you're back!" One little girl hugged her tightly. My grandmother said you were on television. Yetunde laughed awkwardly. So I've heard. The villagers welcomed her home with smiles and warm food. Old women thanked her for returning safely. Young mothers asked how Mr. Adeyemi was feeling. Life seemed wonderfully ordinary again. That evening, Yetunde visited Mama Folake's grave beneath the large iroko tree overlooking the village. She placed fresh white flowers beside the simple stone marker. I wish you were here. She sat quietly for several minutes. I only did what you taught me. The doctors did the difficult part. A cool evening breeze rustled through the trees. For the first time in days, Yetunde felt peaceful. She believed the story was ending. She was wrong. The following morning, strange things began happening. A black SUV slowly drove through the village. Nobody recognized it. The vehicle stopped near the community well. Two well-dressed strangers stepped out carrying cameras. They photographed Yetunde's house, the footpaths, the school, the health post. Without speaking to anyone, they drove away. Later that afternoon, another unfamiliar vehicle appeared. This time the occupants questioned several villagers. How long has Yetunde lived here? Does she have family? Does she own land? Who taught her medicine? The questions felt unusual. By evening, word had spread throughout the village. People began wondering why outsiders suddenly cared so much about one ordinary young woman. Just after dark, Yetunde found an unmarked envelope pushed beneath her front door. There was no stamp, no signature, only one typed sentence. Stop talking about what happened to Olalekan Adeyemi. Forget everything you saw. She read it twice, then a third time. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. She had never accused anyone. She had never spoken against any hospital. She had simply answered journalists honestly. Why would anyone want to silence her? Outside the village was quiet. Too quiet. Unaware that several hundred kilometers away, someone was already planning the next move against her. Yetunde barely slept that night. The anonymous letter remained on the small wooden table beside her bed. She had folded it several times, hoping that somehow the words would become less frightening. They never did. Stop talking about what happened to Olalekan Adeyemi. Forget everything you saw. She read it one final time before placing it inside an old notebook that had once belonged to Mama Folake. Her grandmother had often said, "When fear tells you to hide the truth, write the truth down instead. Memories fade, written words remain." At sunrise, Yetunde walked to the community well as she always did. She refused to let fear change her routine. Children greeted her with cheerful smiles. Women carrying baskets of vegetables asked about Mr. Adeyemi's recovery. An elderly farmer thanked her again for representing the village with dignity. Yetunde answered every question politely, but she deliberately avoided discussing the hospitals. She did not want rumors to grow any larger. As she filled 2 buckets with water, she noticed something unusual. The same black SUV she had seen the previous afternoon was parked beneath a large mango tree at the edge of the village. Its windows were heavily tinted. The engine remained running. She quietly looked away and continued walking home. Across the road, her elderly neighbor, Baba Samuel, noticed the vehicle as well. He frowned. "Those people have been here since dawn." Yetunde stopped. "They haven't spoken to anyone. They've spoken to too many people." "What do you mean?" "They keep asking about you." She sighed softly. "I don't understand why." Baba Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever this is, you won't face it alone." That simple promise warmed her heart. It reminded her why she had never wanted to leave the village. People there looked after one another. Meanwhile, more than 100 kilometers away, Olalekan Adeyemi stood for the first time since collapsing. A nurse remained beside him while he slowly walked across his hospital room. His legs still felt weak. His breathing became slightly heavier after only a few steps, but compared to 2 days earlier, his recovery was remarkable. Professor Ibrahim entered carrying fresh test results. "You've improved enough to begin light rehabilitation." Olalekan smiled. "I've never been so grateful to take 10 steps." The professor laughed quietly. "Illness has a way of changing priorities." "It certainly does." Olalekan became thoughtful. "I've had time to think." "About your companies?" "No. My hospitals." Professor Ibrahim understood immediately. Olalekan continued. "I've spent years funding buildings, equipment, scholarships, but I rarely asked one important question." "What question?" "Can the poorest family reach these services when every minute matters?" Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, the professor answered, "That's the question our country should be asking." Later that afternoon, Olalekan requested every report concerning emergency medical access in rural Ogun State. Boxes of documents soon filled his room. Transportation statistics, clinic staffing levels, ambulance response times, mortality reports, infrastructure surveys. He spent hours reading. The numbers were heartbreaking. Entire communities depended upon one nurse. Ambulances sometimes traveled more than 90 minutes before reaching remote villages. Several clinics lacked reliable electricity. Others had no laboratory equipment. Some villages had no trained first responders at all. He slowly closed the final report. "We've been celebrating hospital construction." He looked toward Aderonke. "But people cannot benefit from hospitals they never reach." She nodded sadly. "I know." "No." He gently shook his head. I knew it intellectually. Now, I understand it emotionally." Across the city, Chief Raymond Bassi received another report. His assistant entered carrying a folder. "We've completed our investigation." Raymond opened it. Yetunde Akinola, age 24, no criminal history, no political connections, no medical license, raised by grandmother, community volunteer, excellent reputation, no significant assets. He flipped through several pages. "That's all?" "Yes, sir." Raymond frowned. "There has to be something." "There isn't. No debts." "None." "No scandals." "None." "No hidden business interests." "Nothing." Raymond leaned back in his chair. People like Yetunde frustrated him. They couldn't be controlled through wealth because they had never pursued wealth. They couldn't be threatened with public embarrassment because they had nothing to hide. He looked toward his assistant. "If you cannot discredit the person, change the story." His assistant understood. Within hours, anonymous social media accounts began spreading misleading rumors. Some posts claimed Yetunde had secretly studied overseas. Others insisted the entire ambulance incident had been staged. One account falsely alleged she had accepted millions of dollars from the Adeyemi family. None of it was true. Yet false stories often traveled faster than facts. By evening, television debate programs had already begun arguing. Was Yetunde really responsible? Is the media exaggerating her role? Should traditional knowledge receive more recognition? The discussion became increasingly polarized. Professor Ibrahim watched one broadcast from his office before switching it off in frustration. "They're asking the wrong questions." Dr. Chibuzo looked up. What should they be asking? Why 3 hospitals refused a dying patient? Instead, everyone wants arguments. At that exact moment, Olalekan entered the office. "I've decided something." The 2 doctors looked toward him. "I'm leaving tomorrow." Dr. Chibuzo immediately objected. "You still need rest." "I'll continue recovering." "But not here." Professor Ibrahim asked, Where are you going? Olalekan smiled faintly. To Yetunde's village. Both doctors looked surprised. The media will follow you. Not if they don't know. Adeyemi entered carrying a small travel bag. We've arranged everything quietly. No public announcement. No television crews. No government officials. Professor Ibrahim understood. You don't want publicity. Olalekan nodded. I want understanding. The following morning before sunrise, 2 ordinary SUVs quietly left the hospital through a service entrance. No flashing lights, no police escort, no reporters. Only Olalekan Adeyemi, Dr. Chibuzo Tunde, Balogun, and 1 driver. Several hours later, the vehicles turned onto the narrow dirt road leading toward Yetunde's village. Olalekan looked through the window silently. He noticed children walking long distances to school, women carrying water containers beneath the hot sun, farmers transporting produce using old bicycles because trucks could not reach their fields. Then he noticed something else. A young pregnant woman sat beside the road holding her stomach in pain. Her husband stood anxiously beside her. The nearest clinic was still many kilometers away. Without hesitation, Olalekan asked the driver to stop. Dr. Chibuzo immediately examined the woman. She needs hospital assessment. The husband looked helpless. We've been waiting nearly 2 hours. No transport has passed. Olalekan slowly looked down the rough road stretching toward the horizon. 2 hours. For one pregnant woman. His chest tightened. If his own convoy had not arrived, she might have waited much longer. As the journey continued, similar scenes appeared again and again. An elderly man, walking with a badly infected foot. A child coughing violently while being carried by his older sister. A motorcycle serving as an improvised ambulance. Everything Yetunde had lived with every day. Everything Olalekan had never truly seen. By late afternoon, the convoy finally reached the village. Children stopped playing. Villagers looked curiously toward the unfamiliar vehicles. Yetunde, who had been teaching basic wound care beneath the old baobab tree, looked up in surprise. She never expected to see Olalekan Adeyemi standing there, still recovering, still walking slowly, but smiling. He approached her quietly. I came to say thank you. Yetunde smiled warmly. You came much farther than necessary. Olalekan looked around at the simple village. No. I think... He paused, taking in the aging clinic, the cracked dirt roads, and the hopeful faces of the villagers. I finally came to the place I should have visited years ago. The entire village gathered beneath the great baobab tree within minutes. Word traveled quickly. Mr. Adeyemi is here. The billionaire survived. He's visiting Yetunde. No one had ever seen so many unfamiliar vehicles parked along the dusty village road, yet the atmosphere felt surprisingly peaceful. Olalekan insisted there would be no formal ceremony. No speeches, he told Tunde. No cameras. I came to listen. The villagers were hesitant at first. Most had only seen wealthy businessmen on television. They expected expensive suits, bodyguards giving orders, and polite promises that disappeared as quickly as they were spoken. Instead, Olalekan asked for a wooden chair like everyone else. When an elder apologized that it looked old, he smiled. My father sat on chairs like this all his life. It feels familiar. That single sentence eased the tension. Children resumed playing nearby. Women continued sorting vegetables. The atmosphere became natural again. Yetunde poured a cup of warm ginger tea for Olalekan. My grandmother believed visitors should never leave thirsty. He accepted it gratefully. I've heard a great deal about Mama Folake. Yetunde smiled softly. Everything good people say about me belongs to her. As they spoke, Dr. Chibuzo quietly toured the tiny village health post. The building consisted of only 3 small rooms, one examination bed, a rusty medicine cabinet, a refrigerator that worked only when electricity was available. Several shelves were completely empty. A nurse named Bisi welcomed him warmly. "We're honored to have you." Dr. Chibuzo looked around. "How many patients do you see each week?" She opened an old notebook. "Usually between 100 and 130. He looked surprised. "With only 2 staff?" "Only 1. My assistant left 6 months ago." "What happens when you're off duty?" She smiled sadly. "I'm never really off duty." The words stayed with him. Outside, Olalekan walked slowly through the village, accompanied by Yetunde. She showed him the hand pump where families collected water, the abandoned maternity room that had not been used for years because there was no midwife, the classroom where volunteers occasionally taught first aid lessons, the broken bridge that became impassable every rainy season. "How far is the nearest hospital?" Olalekan asked Kate. "About 40 kilometers. And ambulances?" "If the road is dry, perhaps an hour." "And during heavy rain?" Yetunde hesitated. "Sometimes they don't come." Olalekan stopped walking. "What do families do?" "They pray." Her answer was quiet, matter of fact, without bitterness. That somehow made it even more painful. Later that afternoon, villagers gathered beneath the baobab tree for an open discussion. Nobody expected what happened next. Instead of making promises, Olalekan began asking questions. How many pregnant women travel outside the village every month? What illnesses affect children? Most often, which medicines run out first? What prevents people from reaching hospitals quickly? Every answer was written carefully into a notebook. Tunde watched silently. He had accompanied Olalekan on hundreds of business trips. This was different. His employer wasn't preparing a speech. He was collecting evidence. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away in Lagos, Chief Raymond Bassi grew increasingly frustrated. Another television report had aired that morning. Instead of fading, public sympathy for Yetunde continued growing. Worse still, journalists had begun investigating the hospitals themselves. Raymond's assistant entered hurriedly. "Sir, the National Medical Council has requested financial records from several hospital boards." Raymond looked up sharply. "So soon?" "Yes. They're moving faster than expected." Raymond stood and walked toward the large window overlooking Lagos. For years, he had quietly influenced hospital administrators through investment partnerships. Officially, nothing he had done was illegal. Unofficially, many decisions had been guided by fear rather than patient welfare. If investigators examined deeply enough, uncomfortable connections might emerge. He turned toward his legal advisor. "We need another strategy." "What do you suggest?" Raymond thought carefully. Public opinion currently believes Yetunde is honest. "If we attack her directly, it will fail." The advisor nodded. "So, we make people question Olalekan instead." "How?" "We suggest this entire story benefits his foundation." The advisor frowned. "Without evidence," Raymond answered coldly. "People don't always require evidence. They only require doubt." Within hours, anonymous articles began appearing online. Was the ambulance crisis staged to promote charity projects? Questions raised about Billionaire's rural visit. The stories cited unnamed sources, anonymous experts, unverified claims. Nothing could be confirmed. Yet, they spread rapidly. Back in the village, none of the residents knew any of this. As evening approached, Olalekan joined several farmers repairing a damaged fence. His security officers looked horrified. "Sir, You shouldn't strain yourself, he smiled. I've lifted heavier things. A young boy watched curiously. Mister, are you really rich? The villagers laughed. Olalekan knelt carefully despite his lingering weakness. What do you think? The boy studied his simple shirt. You don't look like the rich people on television. Olalekan smiled. Television usually shows expensive clothes. It rarely shows difficult choices. The boy nodded thoughtfully. Nearby, Yetunde quietly observed the conversation. She noticed how naturally Olalekan spoke with everyone. No rehearsed speeches, no exaggerated kindness, just genuine curiosity. Mama Esther, an elderly widow, approached carrying 2 baskets of cassava. She apologized. I wish we had something better to offer. Olalekan immediately shook his head. This is more valuable. She looked confused. How? You shared what little you have. I've attended banquets where people shared nothing. The old woman smiled warmly. You remind me of your father. Olalekan looked surprised. You knew him? She nodded. Many years ago. He came through this village looking for work. He had holes in his shoes. He asked for water. I gave him cassava. Olalekan felt emotion rising unexpectedly. I never knew that. He promised one day he would return. She laughed gently. I suppose he kept his promise through you. That evening, as darkness settled across the village, Dr. Chibuzo and Professor Ibrahim held a video conference with investigators in Abuja. New financial records had begun arriving. One investigator shared his screen. Look at these board meeting minutes. Several hospitals had adopted nearly identical legal policies over the past 18 months. Different hospitals, different cities, almost identical wording. Professor Ibrahim frowned. That doesn't happen by coincidence. Another investigator added, we're tracing consulting firms connected to these policy changes. A third document appeared. Several board members served simultaneously on healthcare investment companies. One name appeared repeatedly, Raymond Bassi. Professor Ibrahim quietly wrote the name down. No conclusions yet. But we finally have a direction. The investigation was becoming much larger than anyone had imagined. Late that night, Yetunde walked Olalekan to the guest house where he would stay. Before entering, he stopped. I owe you another thank you. She smiled. You've already thanked me. No. This one is different. For what? He looked around the quiet village. For showing me something I built companies to solve, without ever taking enough time to understand. Yetunde looked toward the small health post in the distance. Understanding people, usually takes longer than building buildings. Olalekan smiled. I think that's the most expensive lesson I've ever learned. Neither of them noticed a small camera hidden inside a parked vehicle just beyond the village entrance. Someone had photographed every conversation, every meeting, every handshake, and before sunrise, those images would be sent directly to Raymond Bassi's office. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight had barely reached the rooftops of the village when Olalekan's phone began ringing. He had hoped for one peaceful day away from boardrooms, government meetings, and endless decisions. Instead, reality had found him. The caller was Professor Ibrahim. Good morning, Olalekan answered. I'm afraid this isn't a social call, the professor replied. I assumed as much. We've made significant progress. Olalekan immediately became serious. What happened? The National Medical Council and the Ministry of Health have officially opened a nationwide investigation. Olalekan looked toward the quiet village square where children were already walking to school. So it begins. It does. And I believe you'll want to hear the first findings in person. I'll leave immediately." Before ending the call, Professor Ibrahim added one final sentence. "And bring Yetunde, if she's willing." Olalekan looked across the courtyard, where Yetunde was teaching several teenagers how to clean and bandage wounds safely. "I'll ask." An hour later, the convoy quietly departed the village. Unlike the frantic ambulance ride days earlier, this journey felt strangely calm. Yetunde sat silently beside Aderonke. She had never been to Abuja. In fact, she had rarely traveled beyond Ogun State. Everything outside the window felt unfamiliar. Skyscrapers gradually replaced farmland. Busy highways replaced narrow dirt roads. Large hospitals replaced tiny community clinics. Yet, one thought remained in her mind. Why did they need her? She had already told everyone everything she knew. Meanwhile, at the National Health Investigation Commission headquarters in Abuja, dozens of investigators had been working through the night. Walls were covered with charts. Hospital timelines, financial records, telephone logs, corporate ownership diagrams. The evidence had become impossible to ignore. When Olalekan and Yetunde entered the conference room, nearly 30 people stood to greet them. Not because one was a billionaire, or because the other had become famous, but because both had become central witnesses in a case that now threatened to expose years of systemic failure. Deputy Minister Dr. Hadiza Musa welcomed them. "Thank you for coming." She looked toward Yetunde. "And thank you for agreeing to speak with us." Yetunde nodded politely. "I'll answer whatever I can." Professor Ibrahim began the presentation. The investigation is no longer focused solely on Mr. Adeyemi's medical emergency. He pressed a button. A large digital map appeared. Colored markers covered nearly every region of Nigeria. What you're seeing represents documented cases over the past 5 years. Each marker represented delayed emergency treatment, patient transfers, administrative refusals, critical delays caused by paperwork. Dr. Hadiza spoke quietly. "There are far more than we expected." Another investigator added, "We've verified over 800 cases." The room became silent. 800. And those were only the documented cases. Professor Ibrahim continued, "We believe thousands more were never officially reported." Olalekan slowly leaned back in his chair. He had expected problems. He had not expected numbers like these. The presentation continued. Families who lost loved ones after waiting outside emergency rooms. Pregnant mothers transferred repeatedly between facilities. Accident victims denied immediate care because insurance verification had not been completed. Children transported for hours because hospitals feared financial responsibility. Every story carried a familiar pattern. The patients were different. The excuses were nearly identical. Then Professor Ibrahim displayed another slide. Corporate consulting agreements, hospital legal policy templates, shared board memberships, financial advisory contracts. One name appeared again, Raymond Bassi. No one accused him directly. Not yet, but the connections were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. One investigator explained, "We're not suggesting Mr. Bassi ordered any individual decision. However, his consulting firms developed legal policies adopted by several hospitals involved in this investigation." Another added, "Those policies consistently encouraged administrators to prioritize institutional liability over immediate emergency intervention." Olalekan quietly closed his notebook. "My companies have legal departments. So do many organizations. But none of them should ever influence whether a dying patient receives treatment." Dr. Hadiza nodded. "That's exactly what this investigation intends to determine." Several witnesses were then invited into the room. The first was an ambulance driver named Musa. He had worked emergency services for 23 years. I've transported hundreds of patients. His voice remained steady. The hardest part wasn't watching people die. It was watching hospitals argue while patients waited. He paused. I once carried a 6-year-old boy with severe asthma. The emergency department asked us to complete financial paperwork first. The child died before the forms were finished. The room fell completely silent. No one interrupted him. No one questioned his testimony. The second witness was Nurse Grace Eze. She described repeated situations where doctors wanted to admit patients immediately, but administrators hesitated because of insurance concerns. I've seen physicians cry. She wiped tears from her eyes. They knew exactly what needed to be done. But permission came too late. The third witness surprised everyone. It was the administrator from the first hospital that had refused Olalekan. He walked slowly toward the microphone. I made the wrong decision. No one spoke. He continued. I convinced myself I was protecting the hospital. But I forgot why hospitals exist. He looked directly at Yetunde. When I saw you standing outside the ambulance, I thought you were the least qualified person there. I was wrong. You were the only one still looking at the patient instead of the consequences. Yetunde lowered her eyes. She did not know how to respond. Professor Ibrahim gently intervened. This investigation isn't about assigning all blame to individuals. It's about correcting a system that gradually taught good people to make bad decisions. Those words changed the atmosphere. The discussion became less defensive, more honest. Doctors admitted moments when fear influenced judgment. Administrators described financial pressures. Nurses shared stories of moral exhaustion. One by one, people began telling the truth. Late that afternoon, journalists gathered outside the commission building. Everyone expected dramatic accusations. Instead, Dr. Hadiza delivered a measured statement. We have found evidence of widespread systemic failures. We have also found extraordinary examples of courage. She thanked emergency workers, rural nurses, community volunteers, ambulance drivers. She never described Yetunde as a miracle worker. Instead, she called her a reminder that careful observation and human compassion remain essential parts of healthcare. The statement received applause from many healthcare professionals across the country. That evening, Yetunde and Olalekan stood quietly on the balcony overlooking Abuja. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Yetunde broke the silence. I never imagined so many families had experienced similar pain. Olalekan looked toward the city lights. Neither did I. I spent years measuring success through profits, donations, and completed projects. And now, he smiled sadly. Now I think the true measure is whether the poorest child receives help as quickly as the richest businessman. Yetunde nodded. My grandmother would have liked that answer. Olalekan laughed softly. I wish I had met her. You almost did. How? Everything you learned from me. I learned from her. At that exact moment, investigators in another office discovered one final document hidden inside newly obtained financial records, a confidential memorandum. It contained signatures, dates, policy recommendations, and enough evidence to justify formal legal action against several powerful figures. At the top of the document, one name appeared in bold letters: Raymond Bassi. For the first time since the investigation began, justice was no longer just a hope. It was becoming inevitable. By the time the sun rose over Abuja the next morning, the atmosphere across Nigeria had begun to change. The investigation was still ongoing. No final verdicts had been announced. Yet something unexpected was happening. For the first time in years, doctors, nurses, ambulance workers, village health volunteers, and ordinary citizens were discussing the same question. How could lives be saved before patients ever reached a hospital? That question occupied Olalekan Adeyemi's mind as he stood beside the window of his hotel room. For decades he had built factories, warehouses, office towers, and scholarship programs. He knew how to build businesses. Now he realized he needed to help build something much more important, a system that could give every Nigerian, regardless of wealth or location, a fair chance to survive a medical emergency. Later that morning, Olalekan invited Professor Ibrahim, Dr. Chibuzo, Deputy Minister Dr. Hadiza Musa, and several respected healthcare professionals to a private meeting. The gathering was intentionally small. No television cameras, no reporters, no politicians seeking photographs, only people who genuinely wanted solutions. Professor Ibrahim opened the discussion. We've spent days identifying problems. He looked around the room. Today, I'd rather discuss answers. Olalekan nodded. I agree. We cannot allow this investigation to end with punishment alone. If nothing improves afterward, then we've failed. Everyone around the table quietly agreed. Dr. Hadiza placed several reports before them. The ministry has emergency funding available. But money alone won't solve rural health care. Professor Ibrahim added, we also need trained people, reliable transportation, communication systems, public education, and trust. Olalekan listened carefully. Then he opened a notebook filled with handwritten observations from Yetunde's village. I've been thinking. He looked toward everyone. What if we stop asking villages to survive until hospitals arrive, and instead help villages stabilize patients before transport? Professor Ibrahim smiled. Community emergency response. Exactly. Dr. Chibuzo became increasingly interested. Who would provide the training? Olalekan looked toward Yetunde, who had remained quietly seated near the end of the table. You. She immediately shook her head. No. Everyone looked at her. I can't. Olalekan smiled gently. Why not? I'm not qualified. Professor Ibrahim leaned forward. What makes you say that? I never attended medical school. I don't have professional credentials. I've simply repeated what my grandmother taught me. The professor nodded thoughtfully. And every time your grandmother encountered something beyond her knowledge, what did she do? Yetunde answered immediately. She referred patients to hospitals. Exactly. He smiled warmly. That's why she was wise. He continued, we are not asking you to teach surgery. We're asking you to teach observation, calm decision-making, basic first aid, early recognition of emergencies, the importance of seeking professional medical care quickly. He paused. You've already been doing that. Yetunde remained uncertain. I still don't think I deserve such responsibility. Aderonke quietly reached across the table and touched her hand. Sometimes responsibility chooses us before confidence does. The room became silent. Olalekan looked at Yetunde. My foundation can build clinics. It can purchase ambulances. It can fund scholarships. But it cannot teach compassion. That, he smiled, is something you've already demonstrated. Yetunde lowered her eyes. She thought of Mama Folake, every Saturday beneath the baobab tree, teaching children how to wash wounds, helping elderly villagers recognize dangerous fevers, repeating the same lesson countless times. Knowledge belongs to everyone. Tears slowly formed in Yetunde's eyes. I think, she whispered, my grandmother would want me to continue. Professor Ibrahim smiled. I believe she already has. The meeting continued for several hours. Ideas gradually became practical plans, regional emergency training centers, scholarships for rural nursing students, motorcycle first response units for villages unreachable by ambulances, mobile telemedicine services connecting community health workers with hospital specialists, emergency radio networks, village first aid education programs, everything focused on cooperation rather than replacement. Traditional community knowledge would support, not compete with modern medicine. By late afternoon, Olalekan stood before a large whiteboard covered with diagrams. At the top, he carefully wrote 5 words: Adeyemi Rural Health Initiative. The room applauded quietly, not because of the name, because everyone understood what it represented: hope. Later that evening, Olalekan and Yetunde walked through a botanical garden near the conference center. Security officers followed at a respectful distance. The air was cool after a brief afternoon rain. Birds settled into the trees as the sky slowly turned orange. Olalekan broke the silence. "May I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "What was your dream before all of this happened?" Yetunde smiled faintly. "I wanted to become a nurse." "What stopped you?" "My grandmother became ill. We spent everything caring for her. I never regretted it. But university became impossible." Olalekan stopped walking. "How old were you?" 19. "You never applied again?" She shook her head. "The village needed me." He looked at her thoughtfully. "The village still needs you." "Yes. But perhaps," he smiled, "it also needs a properly trained medical professional." She understood immediately. "No?" He laughed softly. "You answered before I finished. I can't accept charity. This isn't charity." "What is it?" "A scholarship. I've funded thousands. You would simply become another student." She remained unconvinced. "There are others who deserve it more." Olalekan nodded. "There always will be. But tell me honestly, if someone else received the scholarship, would you stop helping people?" "Never." "Then imagine how many more people you could help after professional training." She had no answer. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility. A real nursing school, clinical training, learning directly from experienced physicians, returning to her village with both practical wisdom and professional education. The thought both excited and frightened her. Nearby, Professor Ibrahim quietly approached. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Olalekan replied. The professor handed Yetunde a sealed envelope. "What is this?" "An official admission recommendation." She looked confused. "For where?" "The National College of Nursing and Emergency Care." She stared at him in disbelief. "I didn't even apply." Professor Ibrahim smiled. "You don't need to decide today. But I wanted you to know. Some opportunities arrive because you've already demonstrated who you are." Tears rolled gently down Yetunde's cheeks, not because of the scholarship, because she wished Mama Folake could see that moment. At nearly the same time in Lagos, investigators arrived at Raymond Bassey's corporate headquarters with official legal warrants. Financial records were seized, computers were secured, emails were copied. Several executives looked visibly nervous. Raymond himself remained calm. As officers searched his office, he quietly asked, "Do you believe this changes anything?" The lead investigator answered, "That depends." "On what?" "Whether the evidence tells the same story you've been telling." Raymond smiled slightly. "We'll see." As the investigators continued examining documents, one accountant quietly approached the lead officer. "I think," he whispered nervously, "or there's something you should see." He handed over a secure external drive. "I made copies months ago. I couldn't live with what I was seeing anymore." The investigator looked at the device. "What is it?" The accountant took a deep breath. "Everything." At that moment, neither man realized the files inside would expose years of hidden influence over hospital decision-making. Nor did they know that by the end of the investigation, the truth would reach far beyond one billionaire, one village girl, or even one country. It would redefine what accountability in healthcare truly meant. The evidence stored on the encrypted drive took investigators nearly 12 hours to organize. Every file was cataloged. Every email was verified. Every financial transfer was cross-checked against corporate records. No one wanted to rush to judgment. The investigation had already attracted international attention, and every conclusion would need to withstand intense legal scrutiny. Just after sunrise, the lead investigator, Justice Amina Bello, entered the commission's secure evidence room, carrying a thick binder. Professor Ibrahim, Deputy Minister Dr. Hadiza Musa, and several senior prosecutors were already waiting. Amina placed the binder on the table. "I believe we finally understand what happened." The room became silent. She opened the first section. Over the past 4 years, consulting firms connected to Raymond Bassi advised dozens of private hospitals to adopt identical emergency liability policies. She displayed copies of board resolutions. Every document used nearly identical language. Hospitals were encouraged to minimize legal exposure in cases involving unidentified critically ill or high-profile patients whose outcomes appeared uncertain. Officially, the policies claimed to reduce financial risk. In practice, they produced hesitation. Instead of asking, "How quickly can we save this patient?" administrators often found themselves asking, "What happens if this patient dies here?" That single shift in thinking had changed thousands of decisions. Dr. Hadiza closed her eyes briefly. "A hospital cannot fear compassion." Professor Ibrahim nodded. "The moment fear becomes stronger than duty, patients begin paying the price." Another investigator connected the external drive to the secure system. Hundreds of emails appeared. Most concerned ordinary business matters. Then one particular chain caught everyone's attention. Months before Olalekan's medical emergency, several executives had discussed increasing legal protections for hospitals treating influential public figures. One executive wrote, "Negative publicity from unsuccessful emergency cases presents unacceptable financial exposure." Another replied, "Administrators should be reminded that patient acceptance remains a management decision." There was no instruction to refuse treatment. No direct conspiracy ordering hospitals to reject Olalekan. Instead, investigators found something equally troubling: a culture. Years of policies, meetings, and incentives had gradually taught administrators to value institutional protection above immediate emergency action. Justice Amina quietly summarized it. No single document ordered hospitals to abandon patients, but together, these documents rewarded hesitation. The prosecutors agreed. Sometimes the greatest harm came not from one illegal order, but from thousands of small decisions pointing people in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Olalekan sat with Yetunde in a quiet conference room nearby. Neither knew the details investigators had uncovered. They spoke instead about the future. Olalekan unfolded architectural drawings across the table. "I've been working through the night." Yetunde looked at the sketches. "What are these?" "The first community emergency resource centers." He pointed to different sections: training rooms, telemedicine equipment, medicine storage, emergency communication systems, accommodation for rotating nurses. Small but efficient treatment areas designed to stabilize patients before transport. "We'll begin with Ogun State, then expand." Yetunde carefully studied every page. "They're beautiful." Olalekan smiled. "They'll only matter if people trust them." She nodded. "Trust isn't built with buildings." It's built one patient at a time. He laughed softly. I've noticed you always reduce complicated problems to simple truths. My grandmother usually did that. And she was usually right. Before they could continue, Professor Ibrahim entered. The commission would like both of you to attend this afternoon's announcement. Olalekan immediately asked, have they reached conclusions? They have reached preliminary findings. Were hospitals deliberately trying to kill patients? Professor Ibrahim answered carefully, no. But the investigation found something perhaps even more dangerous. What? A system that unintentionally rewarded fear. Several hours later, the National Health Investigation Commission held its largest press conference in decades. Hundreds of journalists filled the auditorium. Doctors, hospital administrators, medical students, patient advocacy groups, families who had lost loved ones. Everyone waited. Justice Amina Bello stepped to the podium. Over the past several days, our commission has examined thousands of pages of evidence. We interviewed physicians, nurses, administrators, ambulance personnel, legal advisors, and patients. She paused. Our findings reveal widespread systemic failures. Large screens displayed summary charts, emergency admission delays, duplicated liability policies, communication failures, rural access disparities, administrative bottlenecks, Justice Amina continued. We found no evidence that hospitals conspired to harm Mr. Olalekan Adeyemi. Several reporters immediately began writing. However, she continued, we found overwhelming evidence that fear of institutional liability repeatedly delayed emergency decisions. The room remained completely silent. We therefore recommend immediate nationwide reforms. The recommendations appeared one by one. Mandatory emergency stabilization before financial verification. Legal protection for healthcare workers acting in good faith during emergencies. Standardized national emergency admission procedures. Expanded rural emergency training. Independent oversight of hospital emergency policies. Transparent reporting requirements. The audience applauded, not because the work was finished, because meaningful change finally seemed possible. Justice Amina then surprised everyone. I would also like to recognize two individuals. Olalekan and Yetunde stood. She looked toward Yetunde first. You reminded our nation that careful observation, humility, and compassion save lives. Then she turned toward Olalekan. You transformed a personal tragedy into an opportunity for national improvement. The applause lasted several minutes. Neither of them looked comfortable receiving it. After the conference ended, journalists once again surrounded Yetunde. This time, the questions were different. What advice would you give young people? She smiled. Keep learning. Ask questions. And never believe kindness is too small to matter. Another reporter asked, do you consider yourself a hero? She shook her head immediately. No. The real heroes are the healthcare workers who continue serving despite impossible circumstances. Nearby, Dr. Chibuzo smiled proudly. That answer captured exactly who Yetunde had always been. Late that afternoon, legal officers formally notified Raymond Bassi that multiple regulatory proceedings would begin. He sat alone in his office, reading the documents. His lawyers discussed possible defenses, appeals, procedural arguments, corporate restructuring. Raymond listened quietly before raising one hand. The room fell silent. He looked toward the city skyline. For years, I convinced myself I was protecting institutions. He closed the folder. I stopped asking who the institutions were supposed to protect. None of his lawyers answered. There was nothing to say. As evening approached, Olalekan asked Yetunde to accompany him to the rooftop terrace of the commission building. The city stretched endlessly beneath them. Traffic moved through the streets. Helicopters crossed the fading sky. For several minutes, they simply watched the sunset. Finally, Olalekan spoke. When I collapsed, I believed surviving would be the greatest gift. He smiled gently. I was wrong. Yetunde looked at him curiously. What was the greater gift? The chance to understand. He looked toward the horizon. If I had recovered quietly after the first hospital, none of this would have happened. No investigation, no reforms, no conversations, no hope for families we've never met. Yetunde nodded. Sometimes, the hardest days become the beginning of better ones. At that moment, Aderanki joined them, carrying a small envelope. She handed it to Yetunde. What is it? A letter. From whom? The National College of Nursing and Emergency Care. Yetunde smiled softly. I thought I had more time before deciding. Aderanki returned her smile. You do. But whatever you choose, you'll never walk the journey alone. Yetunde held the unopened envelope against her heart. For the first time since everything had begun, she wasn't thinking about fear. She was thinking about the future. Only one final chapter remained before the story that had started with one frightened village girl. One mysterious illness and one carefully observed detail would finally reach its true conclusion. 1 month later, the story that had once dominated newspaper headlines was no longer simply about a billionaire who survived a mysterious medical emergency. It had become a story about change. Across Nigeria, hospitals had begun implementing the Commission's emergency recommendations. Some changes happened immediately. Emergency departments introduced new admission protocols that required patients in critical condition to receive stabilization before administrative paperwork could delay care. Several hospital boards revised legal policies that had unintentionally encouraged hesitation. Training sessions were organized for administrators, emphasizing that protecting patients must always come before protecting institutions. The reforms did not solve every problem overnight. No one pretended they would. But for the first time in years, healthcare professionals across the country felt that their voices had been heard. At the Federal University Teaching Hospital, Professor Ibrahim stood before a group of young medical residents. Behind him, a slide displayed only one sentence: never stop observing. He looked around the lecture hall. Medicine is built upon science. He paused. But science begins with careful observation. He described the day Olalekan had arrived. He praised Dr. Chibuzo for remaining open-minded, even under extraordinary pressure. He commended the nurses who had continued working despite exhaustion. And when he spoke about Yetunde, he chose his words carefully. She did not replace medicine. She reminded medicine to remain curious. The students wrote those words into their notebooks. Many would remember them for the rest of their careers. Meanwhile, in Ogun State, construction had already begun on the first Adeyemi Rural Emergency Resource Center. Unlike many impressive buildings designed mainly for ceremonies, this one reflected practical experience. The treatment rooms were simple. The communication equipment connected directly with referral hospitals. Storage areas were stocked with emergency supplies. Training halls were large enough to accommodate volunteers from surrounding villages. Motorcycles equipped for first response transport stood beside two newly purchased ambulances. Every design choice answered a real problem Olalekan had witnessed during his visit to Yetunde's village. At the entrance stood a modest stone plaque. It did not bear Olalekan's name in large letters. Instead, it carried a short message. Every life deserves a fair chance. When reporters asked why his name appeared only in small print below the message, Olalekan smiled. The building isn't about me. It's about the people who will walk through these doors. Elsewhere, Yetunde stood beneath the familiar baobab tree where Mama Folake had once taught neighborhood children. The same wooden benches remained, the same dusty ground, the same curious faces. Only one thing had changed. There were more students than ever before. Young mothers, farmers, teachers, motorcycle riders, village elders. Everyone wanted to learn basic emergency response. Yetunde held up a clean bandage. The first responsibility isn't to become a doctor. She smiled. The first responsibility is to recognize when someone needs help. She demonstrated how to keep an injured person calm while waiting for professional care. She explained the importance of clean water safe wound, care recognizing warning signs of stroke and severe allergic reactions, and contacting emergency services as quickly as possible. She repeated one lesson over and over. If you don't know, ask. If you're unsure, refer. Pride should never be stronger than a patient's safety. The villagers applauded. Several nurses from nearby clinics had begun attending her sessions as well, not because Yetunde knew everything, but because she never stopped learning herself. A few weeks later, Yetunde traveled to Abuja once again. This time she was not attending an investigation. She carried a small suitcase. Inside were neatly folded clothes, several notebooks, and Mama Foleke's worn journal. She stood outside the National College of Nursing and Emergency Care, reading her admission letter one final time. The scholarship had been awarded without conditions. There were no publicity requirements, no contracts requiring future employment. Olalekan had insisted on one rule only. She would always remain free to choose her own path. As Yetunde entered the campus gates, she paused. She looked toward the sky. "Thank you, Grandma. I'll study as hard as I can. I promise." At nearly the same time, regulatory hearings involving Raymond Bassi concluded. The investigations determined that while no evidence proved he had ordered hospitals to reject individual patients, his consulting companies had promoted governance practices that placed excessive emphasis on institutional liability during emergency situations. Several consulting contracts were terminated. Corporate governance reforms were required. Independent oversight was introduced for participating hospital groups. Raymond accepted the commission's findings publicly. Standing before reporters, he spoke quietly. "I spent years believing that protecting organizations automatically protected patients. I was wrong. Organizations exist because patients exist. If we ever forget that, we lose the purpose of healthcare." His statement did not erase the past, but it acknowledged responsibility and supported reform. For many families, that honesty mattered. One afternoon, several months later, Olalekan returned to Yetunde's village without media announcements. This time there were no emergencies, no ambulances, no crowds of journalists. He simply wanted to visit. The new community emergency center was already serving surrounding villages. Local volunteers had completed certified training. Emergency radio equipment connected directly with regional hospitals. Response times had begun improving. Most encouraging of all, villagers no longer believed they had to face medical crises alone. Olalekan found Yetunde sitting beneath the baobab tree during a short break from her nursing studies. She looked different, not because success had changed her, but because confidence had quietly replaced uncertainty. He handed her a photograph. It showed the very first graduating class of community emergency volunteers. Nearly 80 people stood smiling together. Teachers, farmers, drivers, shopkeepers, nurses, young adults, grandparents, all united by one purpose. Yetunde looked at the picture for a long time. "They're the real success." Olalekan nodded. "I agree. You started something much larger than either of us imagined." She smiled. "No. My grandmother started it. I only continued." As the afternoon sun filtered through the branches above them, children laughed nearby, while practicing simple first aid demonstrations under the guidance of newly trained volunteers. Watching them, Olalekan realized something remarkable. The greatest investment he had ever made was not a company, not a skyscraper, not even a hospital. It was believing that ordinary people, when given knowledge and opportunity, could protect one another. Before leaving, he turned toward Yetunde. "Do you know what I've learned from you?" She smiled. "What?" "That greatness rarely announces itself. It usually arrives quietly, carrying a small bag, asking careful questions, and choosing compassion before recognition." Yetunde laughed softly. "And do you know what I learned from you?" He shook his head. "Wealth means very little, unless it becomes someone else's opportunity." They shook hands, not as a billionaire and a village girl, not as a benefactor and a scholarship student, but as two people whose lives had been permanently changed by one extraordinary day. Far beyond the village, beyond the hospitals, and beyond the headlines, countless families would benefit from reforms inspired by that single moment when someone refused to stop observing. Sometimes history does not begin with powerful speeches, famous experts, or extraordinary inventions. Sometimes it begins with one ordinary person who notices what everyone else has overlooked. And sometimes the smallest act of compassion becomes the first step toward changing an entire nation. If this story touched your heart, remember that kindness, humility, and careful attention can save lives in ways we may never fully understand. Share this story with someone who believes that ordinary people cannot make an extraordinary difference. And if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more inspiring stories about courage, hope, justice, and the quiet strength that changes the world one life at a time.